The neighborhood was one of those places that seemed too perfect to be real. Lush lawns trimmed to precision, sidewalks swept daily, and driveways that sparkled under the morning sun. The kind of community where every mailbox matched, every hedge was cut at the same height, and everyone's smiles seemed to be rehearsed. It was the pride of its homeowners association, a tightly run suburban paradise where the rules were sacred. And on one cool spring morning, that quiet order was gently interrupted by the low, steady rumble of an old motorcycle. The sound wasn't loud or rebellious. It was deep, worn, and steady, like a heartbeat that had endured decades of journeys. The neighbors peeked through their blinds, curious. The man on the bike wore a simple black jacket, faded jeans, and a helmet that had seen better days. When he lifted it off, revealing the familiar calm face of Keanu Reeves, the whispers began. Keanu didn't move there to make headlines. He never did anything for show. He had purchased a modest, modern-style home at the end of the cul-de-sac. Nothing extravagant, nothing loud. For him, it was peace he was chasing, not luxury. After years of filming back-to-back movies, traveling the world, and enduring the constant spotlight, he longed for somewhere quiet. Somewhere he could just be another face at the grocery store, another man enjoying the evening breeze on his porch. But even in his silence, there was something about him that drew attention. His calm presence, the way he smiled politely to strangers, the way he didn't carry himself like a celebrity but like a man who had seen both light and loss. The motorcycle, however, was the first thing everyone noticed, a dusty vintage Norton Commando from the early 1970s, with chipped paint, worn leather, and faint scars from time itself. To anyone else, it might have looked like an old relic that didn't belong in such a pristine neighborhood. But to Keanu, it was much more. That bike was his father's, the last connection to a man he had barely known. As a boy, he'd watched his father ride off on it, the roar echoing down the street until it faded into silence. Years later, after fame and fortune, Keanu had tracked it down, restored it piece by piece, and promised himself it would never sit idle again. Every time he started that engine, it wasn't about speed or style. It was about memory, legacy, and love. Every morning at dawn, before the sun had fully stretched across the horizon, Keanu would step outside quietly, his boots crunching against the gravel. He'd wipe down the motorcycle with a soft cloth, check the oil, and kick it to life. The low hum would fill the still air, sending a faint vibration through the calm streets. A few neighbors, sipping coffee by their windows, would glance up. Some smiled, others frowned. The neighborhood had grown used to luxury cars, silent electric engines, and rules about aesthetic harmony. This old motorcycle didn't fit into their picture-perfect frame, but Keanu didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't care. He'd ride down the tree-lined avenue, his jacket fluttering behind him, face calm and reflective as the morning wind brushed against his skin. When he returned, he'd always stop by the local bakery near the gate, chatting briefly with the owner, an elderly woman named Ruth, and bringing home a loaf of bread or a cup of black coffee. Those small interactions meant more to him than any Hollywood event. To Ruth, he was just that nice guy with the motorcycle. Sometimes he'd help her bring boxes inside, refusing to let her pay him back. "You've done enough just by making the best muffins in town," he'd say with a smile. The people outside the gated community adored him, kind, polite, grounded. But inside, within those HOA walls, not everyone felt the same. To them, his presence was inconvenient. A celebrity might attract attention, and attention was the last thing they wanted in their carefully curated piece. Still, Keanu remained unbothered. He wasn't there to impress or to prove. His house was simple but warm, filled with books, guitars, and photos of quiet memories. No staff, no entourage, just silence and space. He'd sit on the porch most evenings, the setting sun glinting off his motorcycle parked in the driveway. He liked how it looked there, imperfect, real, alive. It reminded him that not everything beautiful had to be flawless. Sometimes, the things that carried scars also carried the deepest stories. But as the days passed, the murmurs began to grow. Words like eyesore and non-compliance started slipping through neighborhood conversations. A few residents began emailing the HOA president, complaining about the old bike and how it didn't match the visual standard of the community. Keanu never heard them directly, or maybe he did, but simply chose to ignore the noise. Because for him, that motorcycle was more than a machine. It was a symbol of his journey, from loss to peace, from chaos to calm. And while others saw rust, he saw memory. For now, he continued his quiet rituals, unaware that his old motorcycle was about to ignite something much bigger than he imagined. A conflict between appearances and authenticity, between judgment and kindness. In a neighborhood obsessed with perfection, Keanu's imperfection was about to become the spark of a legend. It started quietly, as these things often do, with whispers carried on the soft wind of gossip. A few neighbors began to talk at their morning coffee meetups, not about politics or gardening this time, but about him. About the man with the old motorcycle that rumbled like a ghost from another era. They didn't use his name at first. They didn't need to. "Have you heard that sound in the mornings?" one woman asked, pursing her lips as she set her cup down. "It's disruptive." Another sighed dramatically. "It's vintage, dear," which is a polite word for old and loud. They laughed, their voices laced with that peculiar mix of politeness and malice that thrives in quiet neighborhoods. By the end of the week, someone had snapped a photo of the motorcycle parked in Keanu's driveway, oil-stained concrete beneath it, a faint shadow stretching across the perfect lawn, and sent it to the HOA's email list with a subject line, "Community Standards Concern." Marjorie Wexler, the HOA president, was the kind of woman who took rules as gospel. Her house was the first on the left when you entered the community, a symbol of her self-assigned guardianship. She believed the neighborhood's reputation was a reflection of her leadership, and anything that didn't gleam under her definition of perfection felt like a personal insult. When she received the email about the motorcycle, her lips tightened into a thin, displeased line. She printed the photo, placed it neatly into a binder labeled "Violations," and called for an urgent community board meeting. To her, this wasn't just about a man's bike, it was about order, presentation, and the preservation of control. That evening, the board gathered in her immaculate living room. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, and the scent of expensive candles masked the tension in the air. Marjorie stood at the front, the photo of Keanu's motorcycle projected on a screen behind her. "This," she began, tapping her manicured finger against the image, "is not in compliance with our visual standards. We have guidelines for a reason." A few nodded immediately, others hesitated. One older gentleman cleared his throat. "But isn't that Keanu Reeves?" Marjorie's eyes narrowed. "Celebrity or not, rules are rules. The bylaws clearly state that all visible vehicles must be in presentable, well-maintained condition befitting community aesthetics. This," she pointed again, "is neither." Another woman chimed in, "Honestly, it looks like something from a biker movie." Laughter rippled through the room. The decision was made before anyone could object. A formal violation notice would be issued. The next morning, the letter arrived. Neatly folded, official, cold. It was taped to Keanu's door just as the sun began to rise. The words were mechanical, stripped of humanity. Subject: Community Violation Notice. Dear resident, your parked motorcycle is considered visually disruptive and inconsistent with neighborhood standards. Please remove or store it out of sight within 7 days to avoid penalty. Respectfully, Homeowners Association Compliance Office. Keanu found the letter after returning from his morning ride. He stood there for a long while, the paper fluttering slightly in the wind, the ink glinting in the golden light. His expression didn't change. No anger, no frustration, just quiet understanding. He'd seen this kind of thing before, in different forms, under different faces. Judgment disguised as decorum. He read the letter once, twice, and then folded it gently. Without a word, he slipped it into his jacket pocket, just above his heart, and went inside. By noon, the neighborhood chat groups were buzzing. Screenshots of the violation letters circulated with gleeful commentary. Finally, one message read, "Someone had to say it." Another joked, "Maybe he'll replace it with a Tesla like the rest of us." A few defended him, quietly, timidly, but their voices were drowned in a tide of mockery. They didn't understand him. To them, he was an oddity, a movie star living like a regular man, keeping an old, imperfect thing in a place built on newness and polish. They couldn't see what the motorcycle meant. They only saw what it wasn't. That evening, as dusk melted into night, Keanu sat on his porch with a mug of tea. The neighborhood lights flickered on one by one, glowing like artificial stars. The motorcycle stood where it always did, silent now, its metal faintly reflecting the porch light. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze distant. That machine had carried him through years of loneliness, grief, and reflection. Every scratch was a story, every dent a memory. His father's hands had once touched that same handlebar, and now a group of strangers saw it as an eyesore. He smiled faintly, not out of amusement, but out of quiet disbelief at how people could mistake the essence of something for its appearance. The next morning, Marjorie herself drove by, slowing her car in front of his driveway. She wanted to see if her letter had worked. But when she saw the motorcycle still there, gleaming slightly from the morning dew, her jaw tightened. To her, it was defiance. To him, it was loyalty. Two people, two worlds, separated by the same object. She rolled her window down, called out sharply, "Mr. Reeves, I hope you've read the notice." Keanu turned, nodded once politely, and replied, "I did. Thank you for reminding me." Then he put on his helmet, kicked the bike to life, and rode off, the low growl of the engine echoing softly through the streets. Marjorie watched him go, a flicker of irritation crossing her perfectly powdered face. "We'll see how long that lasts," she muttered, pressing the gas pedal. The seeds of conflict had been planted. What she didn't know was that Keanu wasn't planning to fight her. He wasn't the kind of man who fought with words or anger. His response would come quietly, gracefully, and it would become something the entire neighborhood would remember forever. The following week passed in a strange, simmering calm. The HOA believed the issue was settled, that the celebrity neighbor with the unsightly motorcycle would quietly comply and tuck his old machine away, out of sight and out of mind. But Keanu Reeves wasn't built for confrontation, nor was he built for submission. He lived by a quiet code, one that didn't need words to prove a point. He didn't argue, didn't respond, didn't post a single thing about the incident online. Instead, he went about his days as if nothing had changed. He waved to the mail carrier, smiled at passing joggers, and still rode his motorcycle each morning at dawn, the low rumble rolling through the neighborhood like a steady heartbeat. But behind that calm exterior, something thoughtful was forming. Not revenge, not rebellion, but something meaningful. 2 days later, a note appeared on the community bulletin board near the front gate. Written in clean handwriting, simple and polite, it read, "Community Charity Gathering, hosted by your neighbor, Keanu Reeves. All are welcome. Food, music, and motorcycles. Donations go to local veterans and children's hospitals." There was no grand announcement, no press release. Just that small flyer tacked neatly among lost dog posters and lawn service ads. It puzzled the residents. Motorcycles? Marjorie nearly tore the flyer down herself, furious that the word alone appeared on the board. But curiosity, and the unspoken curiosity surrounding Keanu Reeves, kept her hands still. "Let him have his little show," she told the HOA group chat that night, her tone dripping with confidence. "We'll see how much attention he actually gets." When Saturday arrived, the neighborhood woke to a scene they never expected. Keanu's driveway had been transformed into something remarkable. A row of pristine gleaming motorcycles lined the curb, each one a piece of art, from sleek cafe racers to rare vintage models restored to perfection. Beside them stood a small table with a sign that read, "Every story deserves a second ride." The air carried the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked pastries donated by the local bakery, and soft acoustic music played from a speaker. Children ran about, laughing, as veterans in worn leather jackets chatted with collectors and mechanics who had driven in from nearby towns. And in the center of it all stood Keanu, dressed simply in jeans and a faded black t-shirt, sleeves rolled up, grease on his hands. He wasn't performing. He was helping a young boy polish one of the bikes, showing him how to wipe in slow, even circles. When people approached, he greeted them with the same gentle humility that had made him famous for being different. No red carpet, no spotlight, just a man sharing something he loved. As more people gathered, they began to realize the meaning behind the event. Keanu had invited motorcycle restoration clubs, local veteran groups, and even a few of his Hollywood friends who shared his passion for bikes. They donated their restored classics for a silent auction, every dollar raised going toward hospitals and shelters. Ruth, the bakery owner, had set up a small food stall. There were no sponsors, no ticket sales, no marketing. It was community, pure and unfiltered. Around noon, Marjorie finally arrived, her pearl necklace gleaming and her lips pressed tight. She expected chaos, oil spills, noise, crowds disturbing her ideal order. But instead, what she saw disarmed her completely. Children were laughing. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were shaking hands. The air smelled like joy and old gasoline, two things she'd never thought could blend. Keanu noticed her standing there, awkward and stiff, and walked over. "Mrs. Wexler, right?" he said kindly. "Glad you came." She blinked, momentarily stunned that he even knew her name. "Mr. Reeves." "I wasn't sure what this was about." Keanu smiled, looking toward his old Norton Commando parked proudly at the center of the lineup. "That bike you didn't like, it was my father's. He didn't have much, but he loved to ride. It's old, it's not perfect, but it reminds me that sometimes the things we think are broken still have stories left to tell." He looked back at her, calm and unassuming. "I figured instead of hiding it, I'd share it. Maybe do something good in the process." For once, Marjorie had no words. Around her, people clapped as a local veteran took the microphone to thank Keanu for the donations, his voice trembling with emotion. "This man could live anywhere, but he's here with us, using his home to make a difference," the veteran said. The crowd cheered, and someone whispered, "He turned their mockery into something beautiful." The event lasted until the sun began to dip below the roofs, painting the street in golden light. By the end of the day, they had raised thousands of dollars. But the real change wasn't measured in money, it was in the neighborhood itself. People who had once hidden behind hedges now stood shoulder to shoulder, sharing food and laughter. For the first time, the community felt alive. As the guests began to leave, Keanu wiped his hands on a rag and walked to his old motorcycle. He ran his fingers along the tank, where he'd engraved a small message. "For Dad, keep riding." He didn't announce it, didn't point it out. It was simply there, a quiet tribute. Someone noticed and took a photo, posting it online with the caption, "The HOA called it an eyesore." He turned it into a symbol. By nightfall, the story had already begun spreading across social media. When the last of the crowd had gone, Keanu stood at the edge of his driveway, watching the lights fade from houses. Marjorie lingered a few moments longer, still holding the empty pastry plate Ruth had given her. Finally, she approached. Her voice was softer now, stripped of authority. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "I think I owe you an apology. We misjudged you." Keanu looked at her, that same serene expression on his face. "It's okay," he said simply. "Sometimes people just need a reminder that beauty isn't about rules, it's about meaning." She nodded quietly, the weight of her pride giving way to something unfamiliar, humility. Then she walked away, the sound of her heels fading down the street. That night, as Keanu parked his motorcycle in its usual spot, he looked up at the stars and smiled faintly. He hadn't set out to teach anyone a lesson. All he wanted was to live quietly and keep a promise to his father. But in doing so, he had reminded an entire community, and soon the entire world, that kindness and authenticity still had power. The quiet response had spoken louder than any argument ever could. The morning after the charity event, the neighborhood felt different. The air seemed lighter, and the usual stiffness that came with suburban perfection had softened. Children rode their bikes on the sidewalks, waving to one another instead of keeping to their yards. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now exchanged smiles and small talk. The hum of conversation replaced the silence that had defined their mornings. It was as if Keanu's quiet act had stirred something that had long been asleep. Even the street itself looked changed, not physically, but in spirit. Where once there had been judgment, there was now connection. Marjorie Wexler, however, had not slept that night. Her mind replayed the event again and again. The laughter, the applause, the way Keanu had turned a supposed violation into something undeniably beautiful. For years, she had built her identity on control. The HOA wasn't just a role for her, it was a fortress against chaos, a way to ensure that nothing unpredictable disturbed her version of peace. But as she sat in her immaculate kitchen that morning, sipping coffee that had long gone cold, she felt an ache she couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps admiration, or maybe the slow, humbling realization that she had been wrong. The community's group chat was overflowing with gratitude. Pictures from the event filled every thread. Smiling families, veterans shaking Keanu's hand, children posing beside the gleaming motorcycles. One image in particular captured everyone's attention. Keanu standing beside his old Norton Commando, a young boy perched on the seat, his small hands gripping the handlebars as Keanu crouched beside him, smiling. The caption read, "The man they called a rule breaker gave our kids a hero." It was shared hundreds of times within hours. Someone from the local news station picked it up, then a regional paper. By the afternoon, the story had gone national. Actor Keanu Reeves turns HOA conflict into charity miracle, the headline read. Another article called it a lesson in grace and humility. Reporters arrived at the gated entrance, cameras ready, asking to speak to the residents. Marjorie initially ordered the guards not to let them in, but the board voted otherwise. The world wanted to hear the story, and no one was going to stop it. When a reporter finally managed to catch Keanu outside his home, polishing his bike as usual, she asked, "Mr. Reeves, how do you feel about turning an HOA dispute into a national act of kindness?" Keanu paused, lowering the cloth he was holding. He smiled faintly before answering, "I don't see it as a dispute. I just wanted to share something meaningful. You know, sometimes people misunderstand what matters. They see the surface, rust, scratches, age, but they don't see the story beneath it. That's kind of how life works too." The reporter nodded, clearly taken by his simplicity. "And the HOA?" she asked cautiously. Keanu laughed softly, not mockingly, but with warmth. "They're good people. Everyone just needs a chance to see things from a different angle." His response was honest, free of bitterness, and that honesty spread faster than any scandal ever could. By evening, the world was talking about it. The hashtag Keep Riding began trending across social media, attached to photos of motorcycles, memories, and small acts of kindness inspired by his gesture. Bikers clubs started hosting charity rides in his name, and donations poured in for veterans' hospitals nationwide. Late-night shows joked about it lightheartedly, praising Keanu for outsmarting the HOA with kindness. The quiet man who had only wanted to be left alone had become the symbol of something bigger. Authenticity in a world obsessed with appearances. Meanwhile, Marjorie found herself facing a very different reality. The HOA board held an emergency meeting, not to reprimand, but to reconsider. "We may need to amend the community aesthetic bylaws," one member suggested awkwardly, "to allow vintage or classic vehicles under heritage status." Another added, "He's made our neighborhood famous in the best way possible. People are actually proud to live here now." Marjorie listened silently, fingers laced tightly together. 4 years, she had ruled with precision and pride, her authority unchallenged. Now, that same pride felt heavy, unnecessary. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "Let's make it official," she said quietly. "Heritage vehicles will be permitted. They remind us of where we come from." The board agreed unanimously. Later that week, Marjorie wrote a personal letter, not as president, but as a neighbor. "Dear Mr. Reeves, I owe you an apology. I judged something I didn't understand and forgot that meaning matters more than perfection. You've reminded us all of that. Thank you for bringing our community together and for proving that kindness can rewrite any rulebook. Sincerely, Marjorie Wexler." She slipped the letter into his mailbox at dawn, hoping he'd find it before the press did. Keanu discovered it later that morning, his expression softening as he read. He folded it carefully and placed it beside the original violation notice on his desk, not as trophies, but as reminders of how easily misunderstanding can turn into growth when met with patience. He didn't post about it, didn't mention it to anyone, but those who saw him that day swore he looked lighter, almost peaceful, as if a quiet circle had been completed. The following weekend, Keanu rode through the neighborhood again, the same rumble echoing gently through the morning air. This time, instead of curious or judgmental stares, he was met with waves. Ruth waved from her bakery van, children cheered from their yards, and even Marjorie stepped onto her porch, smiling faintly as she gave a small nod. Keanu returned it with one of his own before riding off toward the open road. That evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, the HOA replaced the old community sign near the gate. The new inscription read, "Welcome to Crestwood Estates, a community that keeps riding." No one announced it, but everyone knew who had inspired it. The weeks that followed the charity event brought a stillness to the neighborhood. one that felt different. The same people who once watched Keanu with judgment in their eyes now greeted him with nods of respect and quiet smiles. The hum of his motorcycle no longer stirred annoyance. Instead, it drew out admiration, even curiosity. It had become a sound that reminded everyone of humility, grace, and the strange beauty of a man who never fought back but somehow won every heart. The HOA, too, found itself changed in unexpected ways. At the next meeting, Marjorie, the same woman who had once condemned him, sat at the head of the table and proposed a new motion: the preservation of heritage vehicles as symbols of craftsmanship and community pride. Her voice wavered slightly as she said it, and though few noticed, a hint of regret shimmered in her eyes. The motion passed without objection. Keanu, of course, didn't attend the meeting. He never asked for recognition, never expected applause. He continued to live as he always had, quietly, humbly, and with purpose. On Sunday mornings, neighbors began to hear that familiar, deep-throated rumble of his motorcycle echoing down the street. Children would run to their windows, pointing and shouting, "There's Mr. Reeves." Some even waved small flags they'd made out of paper, with scribbled drawings of motorcycles and hearts. The once pristine and pretentious street now had something human about it, a pulse, a story. Keanu's presence, once considered a disturbance, had become the very thing that gave the neighborhood life. One morning, as he prepared to leave for a ride, he noticed Marjorie standing at the end of his driveway. She was dressed, as always, in her perfectly pressed blouse and pearl earrings, but her expression was softer now, warmer. "Mr. Reeves," she said, clutching a small box in her hands. He smiled, tilting his head slightly in acknowledgement. "I wanted to apologize," she began, her voice trembling just a little. "I thought your bike was... well, I thought it was an eyesore. I didn't realize it meant something so personal. I didn't realize you meant something so personal." She opened the box and revealed a polished metal plaque engraved with the words, "Heritage Motorcycle, Community Tribute." Below it, in smaller letters, it read, "In honor of Keanu Reeves, for reminding us that character outshines appearances." Keanu's face softened, a small, genuine smile forming. "Thank you," he said quietly. "But I didn't do anything special. I just kept riding." His voice carried that same calm humility that had disarmed the world time and time again. Marjorie chuckled nervously, brushing a tear from her cheek. "That's exactly why you're special," she replied. She handed him the plaque, and for a brief moment, the two stood in silence. Two very different people, connected by an unspoken understanding. He placed the plaque on his porch wall, right above where he parked the motorcycle. It wasn't a trophy, not in his eyes. It was a reminder that kindness and integrity never go out of style. As the days turned into weeks, Keanu's story spread far beyond the neighborhood. News outlets called it the motorcycle miracle, while online communities dubbed it the HOA redemption story. But Keanu never read the headlines. He had no interest in fame, not anymore. What mattered to him was the ride, the feeling of wind rushing past as the world blurred into memory. On one particular evening, as the sky bled orange and gold, he put on his helmet, started the engine, and let the deep purr of the motorcycle fill the air. Neighbors waved, Marjorie smiled from her porch, and children chased the echo of the engine down the street. The world had come full circle, from judgment to admiration, from ignorance to gratitude. As he disappeared down the road, the fading light reflecting off his rearview mirror, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. There was something sacred about that moment. Something eternal. That old motorcycle, once marked as a blemish, had become a symbol of legacy, love, and quiet defiance. It wasn't just a machine, it was a testament to a man's spirit. The same spirit that refused to bend to vanity or pride, that chose grace over anger. The HOA had learned its lesson, but more importantly, so had everyone who watched the story unfold. Never underestimate a man who rides with purpose, because sometimes the loudest message comes from the quietest soul.